Rain fell in thin gray threads over the highway when the lights began flashing behind an old sedan. Inside sat a woman who had spent the entire day inside a military courtroom, deciding the fate of soldiers with nothing but law and conscience. She had no idea that within the hour a stranger with a badge would drag her into the rain, cuff her wrists in front of a laughing crowd, and mock her for having no chance of winning. She would not raise her voice. She would only look at him calm as still water and speak 4 words that would end his career and shake an entire police department to its foundation. See you in court. Naomi Ellison had just stepped out of a courtroom that smelled of old wood and cold coffee, the kind of room where careers were made or destroyed in a single afternoon. For 3 days, she had presided over a military tribunal involving a young sergeant accused of falsifying supply records, and for 3 days she had listened without letting a single flicker of emotion cross her face. That was who she was, fair to a fault, immune to rank, immune to pressure, immune to the quiet suggestions that sometimes came from men with more stars on their shoulders than sense in their heads. In 19 years on the bench, no one had ever accused her of favoring the powerful, and no one ever would. Yet almost nobody recognized her outside the walls of a courtroom. When the robe came off, she became simply a woman in a gray coat, driving a Toyota Camry with more than 100,000 miles on it, stopping for gas at the same station near her apartment, buying the same brand of coffee every Sunday morning. No specialty plates announced her rank. She had turned down the government sedan years ago, telling her clerk that a judge who needed a badge to be treated with dignity had already lost something more important than convenience. She had come from modest beginnings, the daughter of a postal worker and a school nurse, raised in a small brick house where dinner conversations often circled back to fairness, to the idea that rules meant nothing if they bent depending on who stood in front of them. She had enlisted young, put herself through law school on the strength of scholarships and long nights, and climbed through the military justice system, one careful ruling at a time, never cutting a corner, never trading principle for convenience. Colleagues described her as the kind of judge who read every page of every file twice, who asked the uncomfortable question no one else wanted to raise, who believed that the whole point of a uniform was to place a person under the law rather than above it. She had turned down 2 offers to join private practice, where the salary would have tripled overnight, because she believed the work she did inside cramped, windowless courtrooms mattered more than anything a corner office could offer. Her personal life was quiet, deliberately so. She had been widowed young, her husband a helicopter mechanic who had died in a training accident more than a decade earlier. In the years since, she had built a life around discipline and purpose rather than noise. She kept a small garden behind her apartment building, tended a shelf of paperback mysteries she rarely had time to finish, and called her mother every Sunday evening without fail. None of it needed to. She had learned long ago that the truest measure of a person was not what they displayed, but what they carried quietly and carried well. That evening she drove home through a small town she rarely passed through, the kind of place with a single traffic light and a diner that closed at 9. She had taken the back route because the interstate was clogged with construction, a small detour that would cost her perhaps 10 extra minutes and would, though she could not have known it, change the course of several lives before the night was through. The rain thickened as dusk settled, headlights blurring against the wet asphalt, wipers ticking a steady rhythm against the windshield. Storefronts slid past, dark and shuttered, a hardware store, a barber shop with a faded pole, a church with a lit sign announcing a sermon about mercy. She did not think much of it at first. She had grown up hearing stories from uncles and cousins about roads like this one, about towns like this one. But she had also spent 2 decades inside a system built on evidence rather than fear, and she was not about to abandon that discipline over a pair of headlights in her mirror. But something in the way the cruiser drifted closer, then dropped back, then closed the distance again, tightened something in her chest that instinct alone could not explain away. She checked her speed, within the limit. She checked her mirrors. Nothing unusual, no swerving, no broken tail light, nothing that would give an officer cause to look twice. The light ahead turned red and she eased to a gentle stop, hands resting on the wheel, rain drumming softly on the roof. She exhaled slowly, reached for her registration in the glove box out of habit, and waited. She had no way of knowing that the next 20 minutes would become the subject of federal hearings, internal investigations, and a story that would travel far beyond the borders of that small, rain-soaked town. Officer Travis McKenna approached the driver's side with a flashlight already raised, though there was more than enough light from the street lamp above. He was younger than Naomi by more than a decade, broad-shouldered, with the kind of swagger that came from wearing a uniform longer than he had earned the judgment to match it. He rapped his knuckles against the window, and when she rolled it down, rain misted into the car along with his voice, already sharp with suspicion before a single word had been exchanged. "Is this vehicle registered to you?" he asked, though the question sounded less like an inquiry and more like an accusation. He did not look at it, and instead pressed, "Where did you get the money for a car like this?" The Camry was more than 10 years old, dented along one fender, hardly the kind of vehicle that invited suspicion of theft or fraud. Yet the question hung in the wet air as though it were perfectly reasonable. She answered without irritation that she had purchased it used years ago with her own income. He asked if she had ever been arrested. She said no, her voice level, betraying nothing. He asked what was inside it, and she told him plainly that it held legal documents from a case she had just concluded. He asked whose case. Something about her composure seemed to irritate him further, as though her calm was itself a kind of insolence, a refusal to perform the fear he expected to see. He asked where she was coming from at this hour, on this road, and she answered that she was driving home from work, the same answer she had given twice already in different words. He straightened, one hand resting near his belt, and told her that people did not usually drive roads like this one unless they had a reason to avoid the main highway. Naomi replied evenly that construction had closed 2 lanes on the interstate that afternoon, information any local resident could have confirmed with a single glance at the evening traffic report. He did not seem to hear her. "Step out of the vehicle," he said finally. She asked calmly what she was being detained for. He repeated the order instead, louder this time, his hand resting on his belt in a gesture that seemed designed more for the benefit of anyone watching than for any genuine concern about danger. She asked again, and again he offered nothing. No statute, no explanation, no acknowledgement that a citizen had the right to know why she was being pulled from her own car on the side of a dark road. He did not read her rights. He simply reached for the door handle himself when she hesitated a moment too long for his liking, and radioed for backup before she had even fully stepped onto the wet pavement, his voice carrying an urgency that did not match anything happening in front of him. 2 more cruisers arrived within minutes, lights stacking against the rain until the whole intersection pulsed red and blue like something out of a fever dream. A young female officer stepped out of the second car, her expression tightening the moment she saw the scene. An older woman standing quietly beside her vehicle while 3 officers surrounded her as though she were a threat rather than a driver stopped for nothing more than existing. The young officer said nothing, though something in her posture suggested she did not like what she was seeing. She had been on the force less than 2 years, and she had already learned that silence was often safer than conscience. Naomi was handcuffed on the side of the road, the metal cold and unfamiliar against wrists that had spent decades holding legal briefs, not standing accused of anything. Rain slid down the back of her collar as the cuffs closed, and she registered the sensation the way she might register testimony in a hearing, noting it, filing it away, refusing to let it dictate her expression. Travis and another officer searched her car, opening the glove box, lifting the mat in the trunk, running gloved hands along the seams of the seats. They pulled the satchel from the passenger seat and emptied it onto the hood of the cruiser, pages of legal briefs scattering slightly in the wind before an officer caught them and stacked them roughly back together. No weapon, no contraband, no outstanding warrant. One of the arriving officers ran her license through the system twice, as though expecting the second attempt to produce a different result than the first. He read the result aloud to Travis, who barely glanced at the screen before waving the observation away, telling him that a clean record on paper did not always mean much, an assertion he offered with the easy confidence of a man who had never once had to consider what it might feel like to have his own record scrutinized on the side of a dark road. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk outside the diner, phones raised, the blue glow of screens reflecting off the rain. Some watched in stunned silence. Others laughed, the kind of laughter that came easily to people who had never once feared the sound of a siren behind their own car. A man near the corner shouted something about resisting, though Naomi had not moved since the moment they cuffed her. A teenager filming from across the street narrated quietly under his breath, describing what he was seeing, as though building a record he sensed might matter later, though even he could not have guessed how much it would. The rain kept falling, softening the edges of every voice, blurring the crowd into a smear of coats and umbrellas and raised phones, all of it circling a woman who stood motionless at the center, refusing to give any of them the reaction they seemed to be waiting for. Through it all, Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not strain against the cuffs or demand release. She stood in the rain with her chin level and her shoulders straight, the posture of a woman who had spent her career learning that composure was its own kind of armor. One of the newer officers, unsettled by her stillness, finally asked why she was not fighting back, why she had not raised a single objection beyond the calm, repeated question of what crime she was suspected of committing. Travis, emboldened by her silence, decided it was time to end the spectacle. He announced, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, that she was being taken to the station, his tone carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won whatever contest he imagined they were having. Inside the processing room at the station, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, Naomi sat across a metal table from an officer tasked with intake. Her wrists finally free, but her dignity still very much intact. She asked, for perhaps the 5th time since the stop began, what exact charge was being filed against her. The intake officer shuffled papers, avoided her eyes, and admitted that he was still waiting on details from the arresting officer. A sergeant supervising the desk that evening began to feel the first prickle of unease. There was no warrant on file. There was no physical evidence logged, no statement of probable cause beyond a single vague note about the vehicle appearing suspicious in a residential area. What he got instead was a shrug and a vague reference to a gut instinct, the same phrase he had heard often enough over the years to recognize now as a warning sign rather than an explanation. He typed nothing into the field. He simply sat back in his chair and stared at the blinking cursor, aware that something about this particular night did not sit right, in a way he could not yet name. Travis, sensing the shift in the room, tried to explain himself, his words tumbling faster than they needed to. Something about instinct, about experience, about knowing when a situation felt wrong even if he could not always articulate why. When the sergeant pressed him for specifics, for anything resembling a legal basis, Travis grew defensive, insisting that the law would not save her, that people like her always thought a title or a uniform would make a difference in the end. Naomi looked at him then, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with the quiet clarity of someone who had already begun composing the argument she would eventually make in a courtroom far more consequential than this one. She said only 4 words, spoken so softly that the sergeant had to lean in to catch them fully. "See you in court." Travis laughed, the sound too loud in the small room. But something in her stillness made the laugh falter before it fully left his mouth. It was a records clerk walking past the intake desk with a stack of files who happened to glance at the booking sheet and stopped mid-stride. She read the name twice, then a 3rd time, her eyes widening as the letters rearranged themselves into a shape she recognized from federal directories she had cross-referenced only weeks earlier during an unrelated case. She said nothing at first, simply walked quickly toward the watch commander's office, the folder trembling slightly in her hands. She had spent the better part of the previous month processing paperwork related to a joint task force between local and federal authorities, work that had required her to memorize a short list of names carrying clearance levels far above anything her department typically encountered. Her hands were shaking slightly as she knocked on the watch commander's door, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden, dizzying awareness that the ordinary machinery of the evening had collided with something far larger than a routine traffic stop. Within minutes, the temperature of the entire station seemed to drop. The clerk had found more than a name. She had found a title. Colonel Naomi Ellison, military judge, holder of a federal security clearance, vested with an authority that few in that small-town precinct had ever encountered outside of paperwork. The sergeant who had questioned the missing warrant went pale, rereading the intake sheet as though the letters might rearrange themselves back into something less alarming. Travis, still convinced there had been some mistake, insisted that the woman must be lying, that a real military judge would not be caught driving an old sedan through a town like this one without an escort, without announcement, without any of the trappings he associated with power. The phone at the front desk rang before anyone could answer him. The voice on the line was brief, precise, and utterly without warmth. Preserve the scene. Do not alter any records. Do not erase any footage. An investigator would arrive within the hour. The station chief, a heavy-set man named Harold Whitmore who had spent nearly 30 years climbing through the ranks of that small department, walked into the room just as the call ended, his expression already grim, as though some part of him had sensed the shape of the disaster before he understood its details. Whitmore pulled the dash camera footage and the body camera recordings into a private office, watching in silence as the entire encounter played out in unforgiving clarity. There was no swerving, no erratic driving, nothing in the initial minutes that justified a stop beyond an officer's vague and unspoken suspicion. There was no consent given for a search, no warrant cited, no probable cause established before hands were laid on the vehicle and its contents disturbed. He watched the footage twice more, pausing at the moment the cuffs closed around her wrists, then again at the moment Travis told her the law would not help her, a remark that struck Whitmore now as almost unbearably foolish given who had been sitting in the back of that patrol car. He was not thinking in that moment primarily of Naomi Ellison. It would take him several more days, several more conversations, before he allowed himself to sit with the plainer, more uncomfortable truth that a woman had been wronged badly on a street his officers were sworn to protect. The young female officer who had arrived as backup was called in for questioning, and this time she did not stay silent. She admitted, haltingly at first, and then with growing steadiness, that this was not the first time she had seen Travis stop a driver without clear justification. She described a pattern stretching back months. Drivers pulled over for reasons that never quite held together once written down, most of them sharing little in common except the color of their skin and an officer's unspoken assumption that something about them did not belong. She admitted that other officers had noticed too, that whispers had circulated in the break room, that no one had filed a formal complaint because complaints against a colleague rarely ended well for the one who filed them. She had asked him afterward, quietly, whether he had actually seen a violation, and he had laughed it off, telling her that a good officer developed a feel for these things over time, that she would understand once she had more years on the job. She had told herself, the way people often do, that it was not her place, that raising a concern might mark her as difficult before she had even finished her probationary period. Sitting now across from investigators, she said she regretted that silence more than almost anything else in her short career, and she did not try to soften the admission or explain it away. By the following morning, a federal attorney had already made contact with the department, requesting the full record of the stop along with any prior complaints filed against Officer McKenna. Naomi, for her part, made no demands for special treatment. She did not invoke her rank, did not request that the matter be handled quietly through military channels, did not ask for anything beyond what any ordinary citizen would be entitled to under the law she had spent her career upholding. Her attorney assembled the evidence with methodical precision: dash camera footage, body camera footage from 3 separate officers, traffic camera recordings from the intersection itself capturing the stop from an angle none of the officers had considered, and witness statements from bystanders who had filmed portions of the encounter on their phones. Footage that had already begun circulating in ways no department could fully contain. Then, more damning still, 3 other individuals came forward within days, each describing strikingly similar encounters with the same officer over the preceding 2 years. Each stop initiated without clear cause. Each search conducted without consent. Each incident quietly buried in a file cabinet rather than addressed. Another was a retired schoolteacher who had been ordered out of her car at gunpoint after a tail light violation that turned out, on closer inspection of the dash footage, not to exist at all. None of them had filed a complaint before. Naomi's attorney interviewed each of them personally, cross-referencing dates, times, and patrol logs, until a clear shape began to emerge from what had once looked like isolated incidents. The pattern was not subtle once it was laid out on paper. It showed an officer who treated instinct as though it were evidence, who mistook discomfort for danger, and who had never once been made to answer for the difference. It showed a department that had received informal complaints and chosen, again and again, to smooth them over rather than confront them, because confrontation was harder than silence, and silence had always, until now, been enough. A federal judge reviewed the mounting evidence and ordered a public hearing, ruling that the pattern of conduct described was serious enough to warrant open scrutiny rather than a private settlement negotiated behind closed doors. The announcement made local news within a day, then regional news, and then, as the details of a decorated military judge handcuffed on a rainy street corner spread further, national attention began to gather around the small town that had never expected to find itself at the center of anything. City officials scrambled in the days before the hearing, some advocating for a quiet settlement that would keep the matter out of open court, others warning that any attempt to bury the case now would only make the eventual reckoning worse. The city's insurance carrier sent its own team of attorneys, more concerned with limiting financial exposure than with the underlying question of what had actually happened on that rainy street corner. The offers grew larger with each rejection, and each time the answer remained the same, until the city's representatives finally accepted that this case was headed for a courtroom whether they wished it or not. When the hearing finally convened, Naomi sat not behind the elevated bench she was accustomed to, but at a modest table reserved for plaintiffs, dressed in plain clothes rather than the uniform that might have commanded automatic deference. She had insisted on this. She wanted the proceeding to unfold exactly as it would for any citizen who had been wronged, without the weight of medals or rank tilting the room in her favor before a single argument had been made. The city's attorney attempted early to frame the stop as a reasonable exercise of an officer's discretion, suggesting that policing sometimes required instinct that could not always be reduced to a checklist. But each attempt collapsed under the footage itself, which showed with unflinching clarity a woman who had done nothing more than drive home in the rain, followed and detained by a man who could not, even under direct questioning, articulate a single lawful reason for the stop. The young officer took the stand and told the truth in full this time, describing not only the events of that night, but the broader culture of the department that had allowed such incidents to continue unchecked for years. Her voice shook at times, but she did not waver from her account, and something in the courtroom seemed to shift as she spoke, as though her honesty had given permission for others to follow. Internal emails were entered into evidence, showing that supervisors had received informal warnings about Officer McKenna's conduct on at least 4 prior occasions, each time choosing to address the matter quietly rather than through any formal disciplinary process. The retired schoolteacher testified next, describing the night she had been ordered to the pavement at gunpoint over a tail light that dash footage later proved had never been broken at all. The delivery driver spoke after her, calm and precise, laying out dates and addresses with the practiced patience of a man who had learned to keep careful records because he no longer trusted anyone else to keep them for him. But the pattern had already settled into the room like something solid, something the jury could see whether or not the city's attorney wished them to, and no amount of careful phrasing could dissolve what the footage and the testimony had already made plain. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When the verdict came, it named the arrest unlawful, the search unconstitutional, and the underlying pattern of conduct a clear violation of civil rights rooted in bias. The courtroom was silent as the foreman read each finding aloud, and Naomi sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, betraying no more emotion at the announcement of victory than she had shown standing handcuffed in the rain months earlier. Beside her, the retired schoolteacher wept quietly, and the delivery driver reached over to steady her hand. The two of them bound now by an experience neither had asked for, but both had somehow carried to its conclusion. The court further mandated an independent monitor to review the department's stop data for the next 3 years, a condition Naomi's attorney had insisted upon precisely because she understood, better than most, that apologies faded but data did not. Officer Travis McKenna lost his badge that same week, his certification revoked by the state licensing board. A separate criminal investigation opened into his broader conduct as an officer, covering not only the night in question but the earlier incidents that had finally come to light. Chief Whitmore stood before cameras and accepted responsibility for the culture that had allowed such behavior to persist under his watch, offering no excuses, no deflection, only an admission that oversight had failed where it mattered most. He announced, standing at a podium with reporters pressing close, that every open complaint filed against any officer in the department over the preceding 5 years would be reopened and reviewed by an outside panel, a decision that surprised even the city council members standing behind him who had not been consulted before he made the promise. Naomi did not celebrate. She did not smile for the cameras waiting outside the courthouse steps, though reporters called her name and pressed forward with microphones extended into the cold afternoon air. She walked at an even pace, her coat buttoned against the wind, her expression as composed as it had been the night she was cuffed in the rain. A reporter finally caught her attention long enough to ask whether she harbored any hatred toward the officer who had detained her. She answered that she had not brought the case out of anger or a desire for revenge, but so that the next person stopped on a dark road for no reason other than suspicion born of prejudice would not have to endure what she had endured, and would have somewhere to turn when they did not. Her words traveled quickly, repeated across news broadcasts, and shared far beyond the boundaries of the small town where it all began. The young officer who had finally told the truth received commendation for her courage, held up as an example of what integrity within a broken system could still accomplish when someone chose honesty over self-preservation. The department, under new leadership within the year, implemented mandatory bias training, expanded camera requirements, and revised its policies on traffic stops to require documented cause before any vehicle could be pulled over. In the months that followed, the small town found itself slowly, almost reluctantly, becoming a quiet case study for departments elsewhere. Officials from 3 neighboring counties requested copies of the new training materials. The young officer who had testified was promoted the following spring, assigned to help design the department's revised policy on stops and searches, her name now spoken in the station hallways with a respect that had been entirely absent the year before. His replacement, promoted from within, made a point of meeting personally with each of the 4 individuals who had come forward, not as a formality, but because she believed, she said, that trust had to be rebuilt one conversation at a time, not through a single press release. Travis McKenna's criminal investigation concluded with a plea agreement rather than a trial, sparing the town another lengthy proceeding, though the terms ensured he would never again hold a badge in any jurisdiction in the state. Weeks later, Naomi returned to her courtroom as though nothing had changed, though everyone who watched her ascend the bench that morning understood that something fundamental had shifted, not only for her, but for the small town she had passed through by chance on a rainy autumn evening. She wore her uniform with the same quiet precision she always had, medals aligned, posture unyielding, and when she took her seat, the room rose to its feet in a silence that carried more weight than applause ever could. She still drove the same Toyota Camry, its fenders still dented, its odometer still climbing, and some evenings, driving home after a long session on the bench, she would find herself passing near that same stretch of small-town road where it had all begun. She never avoided it. She had thought about taking the interstate instead, adding the extra 10 minutes to skip the memory entirely, but she decided early on that avoidance was its own kind of surrender, and she had not built a life out of surrendering to anything. Instead, she drove through slowly, watching the diner lights, the hardware store, the church with its sign, now advertising a different sermon each week, and she let herself remember without letting the memory own her. The delivery driver mailed nothing, but stopped by the courthouse one afternoon just to shake her hand, unable to find the words for anything more elaborate than gratitude offered plainly and in person. Naomi kept both memories close, not as trophies, but as reminders of the ordinary, unglamorous cost that justice sometimes extracted from people who had done nothing wrong except happened to be in the wrong place when someone else's prejudice decided to act on itself. In the final image of the story that would later be told and retold, the moment lingered not on her rank or her medals, but on the calm, unshaken expression she wore as she looked out over the courtroom. A woman who had been humiliated in the rain and had answered that humiliation not with vengeance, but with the patient, unglamorous machinery of the law. Power makes people afraid. Justice makes people respected. And in the end, it was respect earned the hard way that outlasted every siren, every handcuff, and every laugh from a crowd that had once believed her silence meant defeat.